Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tulika Conversations, where we speak to authors about their works brought out by Tulika Books. I am Suyog, and joining me today is Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Emeritus of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. We are here to discuss his recent book, Beyond Liberalism, Economics, Philosophy, Politics. The book talks about how ideas and theories of politics and philosophy are wedded to certain economic systems. And the particular focus is on liberal and neoliberal ideas and how they help in the advent, expansion, and sustenance of a capitalist system. Uh, Professor Patnaik, individual freedom are seen as the cornerstone of free market economics and liberalism. And sort of capitalism and liberalism champions itself as safeguarding the individual and individual freedom. But you take a contrarian position, which is in line with the Marxist position. And you argue in the book that that's not the case. How so?
Well, basically, liberalism believes that individual freedom can be achieved within capitalism. That basically, capitalism does provide scope for individual freedom. Now, I think basically liberalism's conception of capitalism is wrong. This is what I argue in the book, that there are two alternative conceptions of capitalism. One is the liberal conception of capitalism, and the other is the Marxist conception of capitalism. These are not just two different ways of looking at the system, but I argue that the liberal conception of capitalism is actually untenable, that it is impossible to have a system as the liberals claim the system to be. That basically, therefore, the system that Marx's real innovation consisted in seeing capitalism as being differently structured compared to what pre-Marxian political economy, upon which liberalism is based, had suggested. Now, this is something which, the two conceptions of capitalism, this is something which actually neither Marx scholars nor liberals generally have acknowledged to date, because almost everybody believes that Marx took over the system as it had been defined, as it had been developed, as it had been understood by people like Smith and David Ricardo, and simply built upon it and added to it and interpreted it differently. But my assertion is that no, the system that Marx actually was looking at, and Marx himself may not be very clear about it. Obviously, when you do a theoretical innovation, you're not always very clear about the implication of it, that the system itself, as Marx perceived it, was fundamentally different from the system perceived by pre-Marxian political economy or even by post-Marxian neoclassical economics. This is the crux of my book. Now, in what way is it different? Well, fundamentally, the perception of pre-Marxian political economy was that capitalism was built upon the consent of individuals who come together. That they come together because they find that by coming together under capitalism, they would be able to improve their economic lot. Therefore, it actually sees capitalism as a cooperative system. Okay. While I argue, and obviously this presupposes that there is, by their coming together, there's an equilibrium in which everybody is better off and so on, there's full employment, etc. Now, as against this, I argue that capitalism is not a cooperative system, but a coercive system. It comes into being through a process of primitive accumulation of capital, and through that primitive accumulation of capital, it creates uh, a mass of people who are unemployed, of whom some get employed within capitalism, others constitute the reserve army of labor. And the reserve army of labor, as it were, is an outside of the system. That when you look at the capitalist system, there's an inside, which is capital and labor that is employed by capital, and there's an outside, which is the reserve army of labor. The totality of capitalism consists of both the inside and the outside, and the existence of this outside coerces every individual participant in capitalism, both workers and capitalists, to act in particular ways, otherwise they would be losing their place in the system. So it acts as a disciplining device. And it is this which underlies the process of production under capitalism, because you cannot have a system that is a productive system in which there is no kind of, uh, means of making people work. Under feudalism, this was done through the Monseigneur's whip. Under slavery, this is done by actually a coercion on the slave. And under capitalism, the question is, how is it done? Traditional answer would be that it is done through the fact of cooperation, the fact that everybody comes together. But this is both historically wrong, and also this is something which you find is wrong about capitalism. That if you have full employment, then there's no reason why the workers would be actually either keeping their wage demands limited or even keeping to the production discipline. So the very functioning of capitalism, which is not based on a cooperative coming together of individuals, requires the existence of an outside, and that is the perception of capitalism as a coercive system that coerces every individual to act out their roles that actually constitutes capitalism. And if that is so, then of course there's no question of freedom under capitalism, because obviously it's an alienating system in which every individual is compelled to act in ways whether the person likes it or not.
You also argue how this whole idea of potential in neoliberal order, of the human potential, and I also feel the whole idea of humans as resources sort of presupposes the role of an individual as contributing to accumulation of capital or being a participant in generation of profit for the select few. Do you think do you think that this is true in a way that presupposing an individual's role in society already undermines, like viewing them as potential or as resources, undermines their freedom or sort of dehumanizes them in a sense?
Well, you see, central to capitalism as it originally was, is the fact of atomized individuals. That capitalism essentially, ideally, consisted of a bunch of atomized individual agents. Capitalism, as we see in the world, is something that does not correspond to this ideal. In fact, it's the first system in history where the system and its own potential negation exist side by side. Let me, that Marx said that individuals come together to form combinations, which is what we know as trade unions. Now, initially, combinations are formed by individuals in their own self-interest coming together to raise wages and so on. But fairly soon, it turns out that while the unions are not very effective in raising wages, the workers, out of their own meager wages, actually contribute in order to keep the union going, which is where the maintenance of the union becomes even more important than simply consideration of getting more wages. That is where the individual has transcended pure individualism in order to form, as it were, a combination which is, as it were, very elementary class consciousness. So the and that is something which remains throughout the existence of capitalism. And of course, the unions then engage in struggle with capital. And then there's politicization of the unions. As Lenin said, politics comes to the union from outside, and that's how class struggle develops. But it's a system in which there is perpetual struggle. In other words, system and its negation coexist. You see, while under slavery, under feudalism, you may have had occasional slave revolt or occasional feudal revolt. Normally, it was a system that was characterized by some degree of peace and tranquility. But that's not so under capitalism. It's a system of continuous revolt in some sense, not necessarily, that the very existence of unions, the very existence of this kind of a combination is something that constitutes an act of revolt against the tyranny or rule of capital. And it follows, therefore, that under capitalism, the struggle for freedom is a continuous struggle, the struggle for individual freedom. This is something which is not possible to recognize under neoclassical economics or even under classical political economy. But this is something which is very specific to Marx, and I believe it is fundamentally true. In fact, I use the Marxian framework because I believe that it is true in its perception of capitalism.
Um, Something which you very strongly advocate about in the book is the link between political ideas and economic systems at place. And particularly liberal politics. The liberal ideas which emerged in the post-Enlightenment period and which pretty much shaped the current world order, the idea about equality, liberty, rights. Uh, do you think capitalism or the development in the economic sphere at that time was crucial for the development of these ideas? If yes, can we think of a world where these ideas exist or can sustain themselves and capitalism isn't in the picture anymore?
Yes, I agree that the whole idea of freedom, the whole idea of the liberation of the individual from the tyranny of feudal oppression is something that really gave rise to capitalism. And the idea was that really this is a system in which freedom of the individual would be carried forward. Uh, the very notion of the French Revolution was informed by slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity. But the point is that the economic system that was created was one that actually stifled the realization of these ideas. In other words, that the ideas with which the bourgeois system came into being were ideas that were incapable of being fulfilled within the bourgeois system itself. And I think that is why the case for socialism arose in the first place. Socialism, I must say, is not a negation of these ideas. There is typically a view that, socialism emphasizes not the individual, but society and so on. I believe that's not true. The socialism is based on the realization that individual freedom is possible only when the individual comes together to in as a social collective. That individual freedom is not possible with individuals remaining atomized, but individual freedom is possible only with individuals forming a social collective. The collective does not override the individual, but the collective, as it were, encompasses the individual. That's why I actually talk about individual rights under socialism, okay, including individual economic rights. But the point is that these rights would become irrelevant since the society as a whole would anyway be fulfilling them, not just economic rights, but ideally political rights as well. For instance, I believe that democracy is really incompatible with capitalism, and this is something that we see under neoliberalism, and democracy is really possible only within a socialist system. So, a socialist system is one where the individual transcends pure individualism, but on the other hand, that pure individualism or the individualism is subsumed under a commitment to the collective. Okay.
Um, so, I mean,
So I want to emphasize that I'm not against
yeah.
the values that liberalism puts forward, but I believe that those values cannot be fulfilled within the political order that liberalism generally adulates.
I think you very rightfully demonstrate in the book why democracy is incompatible with capitalism. But I think capitalism has its way of aligning itself with democracy, and that link or that which makes it not so clearly visible in the to the common eye. But I couldn't help but also think about this whole idea of merit when I was reading the book. And even though it's something which you have not discussed in the book, but the whenever merit is brought up in the light of affirmative action or reservation policies, uh, it's seen as these, even though these policies exist as social measures which reflect historical realities, they're seen as hindering uh, people's hard work or sort of incompatible with the idea of equality. Do you think that the people or the critique of reservation or affirmative action and the propounders of merit exist or operate on the same plane as people who think that free market economy or capitalism champions individual freedom? Do you think there is some convergence between these two?
You know, the contrasting merit with affirmative action, I believe itself is based on a sense of discrimination, a sense of superiority. Because I believe the case for affirmative action arises from the fact, from the basic presumption that all individuals have the same potential. And that being the case, some may not be able to realize that potential because they have been historically discriminated against. And therefore, the need for affirmative action arises in order to make them realize that potential. So the case for affirmative action arises from an assumption of equal potential of all individuals. Okay, not that it is going against merit, but it is going against the identification of merit with privilege. Okay, that some people, let's say we look at the Indian society. The Brahmins are the upper caste, and they are the upper caste. They have had access to education. They are in privileged positions, and therefore they appear meritorious. So it is the identification of merit with privilege that affirmative action is actually attacking. Now, there is a separate question of merit. In other words, I'm now not talking about affirmative action, but you can say, look, even if we take a socialist society, we take an egalitarian society, some people appear more meritorious. And there's a big debate about it. That debate says that to the extent that, let us say, merit is something which someone has not, as it were, worked towards, has not earned, but it is God given. Let's say somebody is a good cricketer because that person has a certain gift with hand-eye coordination. Now, if it is a gift, then there's no reason why the person should be paid any more. In other words, it's not a question of the person himself or herself having acquired it through hard work, but it is something which is, as it were, a natural endowment. And if it's a natural endowment, there's no reason why the person should be rewarded more. There's a big debate about it among social philosophers and so on. Uh, uh, I'm not very much into that debate, but nonetheless, I see some merit in this argument that if merit is something which is naturally given, you have a Sachin Tendulkar who is a very good cricketer because he has got some gift which is not common to everybody. There's no reason why he should be paid any more for the gift because, after all, he has not really earned it.
Yeah, going back to trade union and the labor's ability to collectively bargain, you also argue about how the rise of global finance, which is the present form of capitalism, has sort of diminished the trade unionism or the ability of the labor to collectively bargain. And it's also happened with the rise of globalization and the weakening of the nation state system. So, is it then can we say that the nation state then is essential for the trade unions to operate or for the labor to unionize and bargain collectively?
Globalization in today's world means globalization of capital. It is American capital that can go and invest in China, in Indonesia, in India, in Bangladesh, wherever. Now, if you have capital being globalized, but labor is not, okay, and there is no international trade union movement. Trade unions are still nationally organized. And that is why there is an asymmetry that globalization has introduced. And because of that asymmetry, the workers have suffered. For instance, Stiglitz argues that if you look at the average male American workers' real wage in 2011 and compared it to 1968, in 2011 is marginally lower. Why is it marginally lower? Because of the fact that you actually find that the capacity of American trade unions to bid away real wages from the productivity increases that capital has introduced in the US economy is greatly undermined by the fact that now American workers have to compete against Indian and Bangladesh workers who are located in the midst of vast labor reserves and therefore who get only a subsistence wage. So globalization pits one kind of workers, one country's workers against another. It pits all workers against the enormous labor reserves which have been created by colonialism in the third world countries. And therefore, globalization leads to a tremendous weakening both of the economic and the political strength of the working class. Now, the question is that there are two ways that this can be overcome. One is if you have, in fact, an international working class movement, that an international trade union movement, and international coal workers, international steel workers, and so on, who can then go on a strike at a world level and so on. Or the other is whether you can actually delink from globalization and get back to the national space in which capital and labor can then fight it out. I mean, so should the working class be looking towards an internationalization of its struggles, or should the working class be looking at the recreation of a national space through delinking? Now, I opt for the latter because the first is really a pie in the sky. Okay. That being the case, the workers of any particular country cannot wait till the whole world has become kind of, organized in a way that you have international trade unions and so on. So the workers have to fight for their liberation today, and that fight, therefore, must take the form of delinking. Delinking is something which also fits in with a notion of socialism, which I advance in the last chapter of the book, where socialism earlier, you see, if you look at some of Lenin's writings and so on, and certainly the Bolshevik conception was one where it was associated with centralization, central planning. The essence of socialism was central planning. While I'm trying to suggest a socialism which is much more decentralized, more the kind of communes and so on, the commune system in China as it existed in Mao's period, so that people can directly affect the economic decisions or the political decisions that impinge on their lives, rather than leaving it to the central plan, because if you leave it to the central plan, in some sense, you're actually again being treated as an object rather than subject. Okay, because the plan tells you where you should be employed and so on and so forth. So, because of this, I actually develop in my last chapter a decentralized notion of socialism, and that would also fit in with the revival of the nation state. Because let's not forget, today the nation state is the one area in which people exercise their voting rights. Okay, they don't vote at a world level. So we don't have world government, we don't have world elections, but we do have national elections. And that being the case, wherever people exercise that right should be the place where economic decisions also should be taken, and so on.
This brings me to the last question, which is about this broad heterogeneous category of left liberal. I believe it was mostly used in an American context, but in the last decade or so, at least on social media and popular public platforms, anybody who is critiquing authoritarian or totalitarian regimes or policies is sort of hurled at with this term, and which has led to clubbing together of a broad range of people. Do you think this category makes sense in the present world order? Are there points of congruences and divergences between the left and the liberal? What does it enable, or what does it smudge? Uh,
Well, I mean, at the moment, as you know, there is a tendency towards a neo-fascist movement across the world. Whether you take Milei in Argentina, whether you take Trump in the United States, whether you take Orban in Hungary, whether you take Meloni in Italy, whether you take Marine Le Pen in France, whether you take UKIP in Britain, whether you take Modi in India, there is across the world a certain neo-fascist upsurge. Let's ask ourselves the question, why is there this upsurge? This upsurge, to my mind, is in fact the logical culmination of neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism, you see, the post-war period of dirigist intervention, which in the advanced capitalist countries took the form of welfare capitalism. In countries like ours, it took the form of planning development in a certain egalitarian democratic ethos, at least being committed to an egalitarian democratic ethos, paying lip service to it. Now, that is something which is really represented a certain kind of new stage in the development of capitalism. Neoliberalism meant a negation of that. Neoliberalism meant a revival once more of enormous amounts of labor, reserve army of labor, not just in the third world, but also in the advanced capitalist countries. Under Margaret Thatcher, you had 3 million British workers unemployed. And of course, now you don't have that much, but nonetheless, the levels of unemployment now in the advanced capitalist countries are much greater than was the case in the immediate post-war period. So, uh, neoliberalism meant a negation of what I would call dirigism, of state intervention, and state intervention within the democratic framework meant the movement towards welfare capitalism, the movement towards egalitarianism, the movement towards an empowerment of the workers and so on, because of which, in fact, defenders of capitalism claim that capitalism has changed. That is no longer the old capitalism, and that therefore, and that was the crux of the social democratic argument. We don't need socialism. Within capitalism, we can actually have the improvement in the rights and conditions of the people that we actually witness at present. This, of course, left open the question of imperialism and so on that did not enter the picture at that particular point in the debate. But nonetheless, it appeared a fairly plausible argument. It had some kind of strength to it. But on the other hand, neoliberalism meant a complete negation of this. Uh, to my mind, as I argue in the book, neoliberalism was a negation of it because capitalism is incapable, given its spontaneity, of really becoming a welfare capitalism. For a while, because of the correlation of class forces at the end of the Second World War, it had to make concessions, and therefore you actually had this Keynesian intervention and so on and so forth. But as you had the consolidation of the power of capital, you had internationalization of capital, you had once more a revival of capitalism in the form that it actually normally exists. And therefore, the incompatibility of capitalism with an authentic welfare state. I'm not saying that welfare state has been completely erased in the West, but there's a movement to withdraw from it. It's not very easy for them to do that, but because of the working class resistance and so on. But certainly we see an erosion of the welfare state everywhere under neoliberalism, including here. Uh, and that being the case, you have a weakening of the working class, you have an erosion of the welfare state, and therefore you have a rise across the world in the share of economic surplus in total output, which gives rise to an overproduction crisis, greater unemployment, and so on. And when you have an overproduction crisis, a situation of crisis is conducive to the emergence of fascism. 1930s fascism had emerged in the midst of the Great Depression. Now, of course, you don't have a Great Depression, but nonetheless, you have a general situation of stagnation that is afflicting the world, and that is something which is again giving rise to a neo-fascist tendency. The difference is that earlier fascism had, in the countries where it emerged and came to power, overcome overcome the crisis through militarism and so on, while now neo-fascism is incapable of overcoming the crisis because the capacity of the nation state, even a neo-fascist nation state, to overcome the spontaneous tendencies of globalized finance capital is really quite limited. Okay. So if you have excessive state intervention in order to, let us say, for whatever reason, increase employment through whatever means, capital would flee that country and go somewhere else where the state intervention is much less. And therefore, globalized finance limits the capacity of the nation state to intervene in in the economic functioning of that particular country, and therefore, even a fascist nation state or a neo-fascist nation state is incapable of intervening to bring about larger employment or larger level of activity and so on. So that is why, the as I mentioned earlier, the liberal ideal of individual freedom is also the socialist ideal of individual freedom. But the difference lies in how we actually visualize its realization. Okay. The difference lies in political economy. in the liberal understanding of capitalist political economy and the socialist understanding of capitalist political economy. Now, that being the case, when this ideal where both liberals and socialists meet is being challenged by neo-fascism, then of course both socialists and liberals would have to defend that ideal. And that's exactly what's happening now. Democracy, for instance. I believe democracy is not achievable within a liberal paradigm of capitalism, but on the other hand, it requires a socialist, it requires for its realization a socialist paradigm. But on the other hand, both liberals and socialists value democracy or should value democracy, and to the extent they do, any erosion of democracy under neo-fascism is one that should bring them together to fight it.
That brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for agreeing to this, Professor Patnaik. It was very nice to have you here.